In the sweltering summer of 1944, the fields of Normandy were not a place for the faint-hearted. For the soldiers of the U.S. Army, the hedgerows were death traps, a labyrinth of earth and vegetation that turned every advance into a perilous gamble. Yet within this chaos, one man looked at the odds and laughed at them. The statistics said that American Sherman tanks were doomed against German armor. A Sherman with its gasoline engine and thin armor was no match for the Panther or Tiger tanks. For every 5 Shermans sent into battle, 3 would be lost before achieving victory. The numbers were cold, merciless, and precise. Most men saw only doom in those figures. But not Lafayette Poole. Poole, known simply as P to his crew, had never been a man to follow rules. Before the Army claimed him, he was a fighter in Texas, a Golden Gloves champion who had learned to end fights quickly and decisively. In the ring he relied on speed, timing, and raw power. He didn't dance or dodge unnecessarily, he struck first and struck hard. When he joined the Army in 1941, that mindset clashed with the rigid structures of military discipline. Drill formations bored him, saluting felt pointless, and waiting for orders was intolerable. Yet, despite the friction, his natural leadership shone through. He was offered officer commissions multiple times, but each he refused. Command tents held no allure for him. His place was in the turret, behind the controls of a Sherman tank, where the battle was immediate and visceral. The Sherman itself was a paradox. Reliable, fast, and mass-produced in tens of thousands, it was still fundamentally a fragile machine in the face of modern German engineering. Its 75mm gun was ineffective against the frontal armor of a Panther or Tiger, and the gasoline engine meant that a single hit could turn the tank into an inferno. American crews had nicknamed their tanks Ronson lighters, because they ignited the first time they were struck. The math of survival was brutal, and the Army's doctrine treated it as immutable. But Poole had a different theory. Weakness, he believed, could be weaponized. The young sergeant understood the danger of a long-range duel with German tanks. Engaging a Tiger at 500 yards was a death sentence. The Sherman's thin armor and flammable engine left no margin for error. Poole's solution was radical. He would ignore the rules. He would close the distance, take the fight to the enemy, and leverage speed, agility, and audacity. By charging directly into the teeth of the German defense, he would turn the Sherman's vulnerability into an advantage. It was a strategy born from boxing, honed in the chaos of war, and executed with relentless aggression. Of course, no tank commander can survive on bravery alone. A Sherman is only as effective as the men inside it, and Poole knew this better than most. He selected his crew carefully, finding individuals whose quirks and skills complemented his own. Wilbert "Baby" Richards, the driver, was a quiet Midwesterner with an uncanny feel for machinery. Under Poole's command, he could coax the Sherman into impossible maneuvers, dancing over terrain that would make lesser drivers tremble. Del "Jailbird" Boggs, the loader, had a criminal past and a simmering rage that Poole transformed into lethal efficiency. He could chamber shells faster than anyone else in the division, turning the Sherman's main gun into a whirlwind of destruction. Bert, schoolboy Close, just 17, brought the eyes and hands of a prodigy to the bow gun. Ann Willis, Groundhog Ower, the gunner, had a preternatural ability to detect threats at impossible distances, and the precision to strike them dead on. Together they became more than a crew, they became a single organism. 5 minds, 5 hearts, and 5 sets of reflexes synchronized with near telepathic coordination. The Sherman was no longer just a tank, it was an extension of Poole's own instincts, amplified by the talents of his crew. They named it "In the Mood," a declaration of intent. They were always ready for a fight. They weren't there to survive cautiously, they were there to dominate. When the crew landed in France shortly after D-Day, the nightmare of the hedgerows became immediate. Villages were pinned down under German fire, infantrymen cut down by machine guns and mortars. Standard protocol dictated caution. Call in artillery, wait for air support, flank, never expose the tank unnecessarily. But Poole saw opportunity where others saw fear. He keyed the radio, his voice cutting through the panic, and gave a single order that would become his hallmark: "Follow me." Without hesitation, the Sherman tore through the hedgerows, mud spraying, engines roaring, and gunfire erupting. German soldiers, accustomed to careful American advances, were stunned. Poole's method defied their expectations. He charged, unflinching, commanding the battlefield with audacity and speed. Within minutes, the crew of In the Mood shattered the German strongpoint. Enemy vehicles burned, machine guns silenced, infantry neutralized. The other platoons emerged to find a lone Sherman sitting in the field, unscathed, its crew alive. In that instant, the legend of Lafayette Poole began to take shape. Rumors spread of a Texan commander who fought as though invincible, who treated a fragile Sherman like a weapon of absolute destruction. But beneath the daring and the spectacle, a harsh truth persisted. Every charge, every engagement, was a gamble with fate itself. Statistically, the Sherman should not have survived long enough to become a legend. Yet Poole ignored the numbers. He ignored the probability. He fought on, shaping destiny through courage, instinct, and an unyielding refusal to accept the odds. The summer of 1944 had only just begun, and Poole was about to test the limits of the Sherman, the limits of his crew, and the limits of human endurance. Normandy was merely the first chapter of a war written in steel, fire, and sheer willpower. The math said he should die week 1. But Poole had already decided that numbers were suggestions, not law. And in the fields of France he was ready to prove it. Lafayette Poole's genius wasn't just in daring, it was in assembling a crew who could turn audacity into results. War is not a solo endeavor, and a tank is not just steel. It's 5 men in a metal coffin with 30 tons of gasoline screaming beneath them. Poole understood that every move, every split-second decision, depended on the synchronization of brains, nerves, and hands. And the mood would not survive without perfect cohesion. At the helm was Baby Richards, the driver. On paper, he was ordinary, a quiet Midwestern farm boy with calloused hands and a calm temperament. But Poole saw instinct where others saw reserve. Richards had a way of feeling the tank, of coaxing precision from a machine designed for brute force. When Poole ordered him to charge headfirst into the heart of German defenses, Richards didn't hesitate. The Sherman moved like a living beast under his control, leaping over ditches, sliding through mud, skimming the edges of hedgerows with surgical accuracy. Then there was Del Jailbird Boggs, the loader, a man whose fury had once put him behind bars. Poole had recognized raw energy in him and channeled it. Every shell slammed into the breech with precision, his hands bloody from friction, his lungs burning, yet he never slowed. The Sherman's gun became a relentless hammer in his grip, firing round after round as though the tank itself had grown teeth. If speed won battles, Boggs supplied it without pause. Bert, schoolboy, close manned the bow gun. A 17-year-old kid with a face still soft with youth, he was an unlikely warrior. Yet in the bow gunner's seat, innocence became lethal accuracy. He swept fields with his .30 caliber, picking off infantry before they could threaten the Sherman's sides. His eyes were sharp, his reactions instantaneous, and his trust in Poole absolute. In the storm of Normandy, a single mistake could mean death. Schoolboy didn't make mistakes. And the final piece was Willis "Groundhog" Ower, the gunner in the turret. Nervous and thin, he would have seemed an unlikely killer, but once he peered through his sight, calm replaced fear. Groundhog's aim was surgical. He spotted targets before they appeared to anyone else and struck them with unerring precision. Poole relied on him implicitly, giving orders and trusting that Groundhog would execute perfectly. Every enemy soldier, every vehicle, every Panther or Tiger was a target that Groundhog could find and eliminate. Together, the 5 men formed a biological machine that was faster, smarter, and deadlier than any mechanical advantage the Germans could muster. The Sherman itself, fragile as it was, became an extension of this machine. Its thin armor, considered a weakness by conventional doctrine, allowed it to be lighter and faster. Its motorized turret could swivel faster than German tanks, giving them an edge in close-quarters engagements. Poole refused to play by the Army's rules. He knew that standing at a distance trading fire with Panthers or Tigers would be suicidal. Instead he charged, closing the gap so quickly that the enemy barely had time to react. Weakness became speed. Vulnerability became a weapon. And the hedgerows, those confining walls of earth, became the proving ground. The first real test came near a village where infantry were pinned down by German machine guns. Standard procedure dictated waiting, flanking, calling artillery. But Poole didn't wait. With a calm born of experience and a daring that bordered on insanity, he ordered the Sherman forward. Mud and debris flew as the tank tore through hedgerows, and German defenders were stunned. The sheer audacity of the approach broke their expectations. They had prepared for cautious Americans, not a tank barreling straight at them, guns blazing, commander standing fully exposed. Within minutes, In the Mood neutralized 3 armored vehicles and silenced the enemy machine guns. Infantry were either dead, fleeing, or captured. When the rest of the platoon arrived, they found the Sherman intact and its crew unharmed, a stark contrast to the carnage around them. That day the legend of Lafayette Poole began to spread, not as a rumor but as an observable reality. The Germans started whispering about a Texan ghost, A Sherman that moved faster, struck harder, and survived impossibly against the odds. Yet Poole knew the danger. Every success was a gamble. Every charge, every encounter was a dance with death. The Sherman might survive, but only if the crew acted as one. Hesitation meant annihilation. And Poole, despite his fearlessness, had no illusions. Each day could be the last. But in the shadows of Normandy, he refused to calculate odds. Instead, he relied on instinct, trust, and the synchronization of 5 men in a tin can. That trust turned panic into action, fear into performance. It was not skill alone that saved them, it was unity, and a refusal to accept the odds laid down by cold, hard math. As the sun set on that first engagement, the crew sat in silence, the smell of cordite and mud thick in the air. No one celebrated. Poole didn't allow it. Survival was not an achievement, it was a necessity, a prerequisite for the next engagement. The war was a sequence of moments, each demanding more courage, more speed, more violence. And Poole, baby, jailbird, schoolboy, and groundhog were ready to meet it all head-on. That was the paradox of Poole's success. His audacity was matched only by his meticulous selection of men and the intimate understanding of the Sherman. The machine could kill, but the crew made it unstoppable. Weakness became strength. Recklessness became strategy. Fear became irrelevant. The math of survival had been defied that day in Normandy, and the crew of In the Mood would continue to test it, hour after hour, field after field. The legend was just beginning. After those first harrowing encounters in the hedgerows, Lafayette Poole and his crew had earned more than a reputation. They had become a force that the German army could not ignore. The 3rd Armored Division was bogged down. Days of cautious advances had cost lives and stalled momentum. German panthers and tigers lurked in ambushes, concealed behind walls, hedgerows, and small villages. Artillery fire was often too slow, flanking maneuvers too complex. Every inch of progress felt like a trial by fire. But Poole's philosophy was simple. Speed was survival, aggression was armor, and hesitation was death. By late June 1944, Poole had begun testing his radical tactics on a larger scale. The villages north of the rivers, once considered impregnable, were no longer obstacles but arenas. German troops, trained to expect careful American advances, were caught off guard when Poole led his Sherman straight into their killing zones. Mud splattered across the tank as Baby Richards drove at impossible speeds through the constricting hedgerows, In the Mood skimming over ditches, brushing past tree roots and rocks. The 75mm main gun roared, shells bursting into machine gun nests and enemy positions, while Bert Close's bow gun and Willis Ower's turret gun shredded infantry that attempted to counterattack. The first major breakthrough came near Villiers-Fozer. German machine guns had pinned the Allied infantry, forcing them to take cover in the mud and foliage. Standard doctrine demanded patience. Call in artillery, wait for air support, flank, don't engage directly. Poole heard the reports on the radio, watched the hesitation, and snapped. "Follow me," he barked into the microphone. Without consulting anyone further, he ordered Baby Richards to floor the Sherman into the hedgerows, plowing through earth and foliage like a juggernaut. For the Germans, it was a sight they had never anticipated. A single Sherman emerging from dense vegetation, gun firing on the move, commander standing exposed in the hatch, calling targets as if the tank were an extension of his own body. In less than 10 minutes, Poole's crew destroyed 3 armored vehicles and neutralized the machine gun nests. Infantry were captured or routed, and the rest of the platoon arrived to find a lone Sherman sitting intact, smoke curling from its barrel, engine idling, and scathed. Poole climbed from the hatch, brushing mud and soot from his uniform. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. There was no time. For him, each engagement was only preparation for the next one, each victory merely a prerequisite for survival. The legend of War Daddy, the Texan ghost who defied odds, began spreading immediately through the division, and even reached German ears. Poole's method had a psychological effect as well. The Germans expected cautious, methodical Americans. When confronted with a Sherman that charged like a predator, firing on the move, they hesitated. Hesitation in war is fatal. Poole's reckless aggression turned German training against them. The predictable patterns of observe, orient, decide, act, Ode, collapsed under the chaos he created. His refusal to follow doctrine became a weapon. Every charge, every maneuver, every daring exposure of himself and his crew to direct fire, forced the enemy into confusion. And in that confusion, Poole struck. As the summer stretched on, Poole and In the Mood became the spearhead of the breakout from Normandy. Operation Cobra demanded speed. Allied forces were pushing to exploit gaps in German lines, and Poole volunteered for the lead position every time. Being the point tank is a death sentence. Ambushes, hidden anti-tank guns and German infantry could destroy you in seconds. But Poole's confidence, or madness, made him insist. He claimed he could spot ambushes before they occurred. Remarkably, he often did. Whether by intuition, experience, or sheer luck, he navigated fields and towns with a prescience that seemed supernatural. In the villages, his approach became signature. The crew moved as one, executing Poole's commands without hesitation. Richards drove like the tank was an extension of his own body, adjusting instantly to orders shouted over the din of battle. Boggs loaded shells with lightning speed, while Close and Ower delivered precise, deadly fire. Poole, standing fully exposed in the hatch, scanned, observed, and directed with unrelenting intensity. His refusal to button up, despite the obvious danger, became both tactic and symbol. Enemy snipers and artillery fire had to account for him in the open, distracted by the sheer audacity of a man who refused to hide. The results were staggering. German units, already stretched thin, were systematically broken by Poole's small, concentrated strikes. Columns of supply vehicles were destroyed before reinforcements could arrive. Panther tanks, feared as unstoppable death machines, were flanked and neutralized. Casualty numbers mounted rapidly, far beyond what a typical tank crew could achieve. Allied forces advanced in confidence, emboldened by the spectacle of the Sherman that refused to die. But with every success came risk. The Mood was not invincible. It had survived hits that would have destroyed any ordinary crew. Poole knew the odds were always against them, yet he pushed harder. The human cost of this style of combat was severe. The crew's endurance was tested daily. Sleep was a luxury. Meals were skipped. Each day they fought at the absolute limits of human ability and mechanical reliability. Richards hallucinated the roads at times, Schoolboy's youthful face hardened into grim determination, and Boggs' rage became a controlled weapon. Poole himself was a relentless storm of focus and willpower, driving his team forward, seemingly impervious to exhaustion. The Sherman became more than a machine. It became an embodiment of their combined skill, courage, and willingness to embrace death as an inevitability. By July, the legend of In the Mood had spread across the division and reached German lines. Captured soldiers spoke of a ghostly Sherman that appeared, struck with devastating efficiency, and vanished. It was no new weapon, no secret innovation. It was just 5 men, perfectly synchronized, refusing to accept the statistical certainty of death. Poole had turned the fragile Sherman into a weapon of terror, but it was not steel or gunpowder that defined its power. It was the spirit of the crew and the audacity of a man who refused to play by the rules. And yet, Poole never allowed himself or his crew to become complacent. Each day, each engagement, was a reminder that the math was always against them. Every success carried the weight of the next encounter. They were living on borrowed time, but Poole's philosophy was clear. Borrowed time is only valuable if you spend it dominating the battlefield. By mid-July 1944, Lafayette Poole and his crew had transformed from a daring platoon into a legend. The 3rd Armored Division had begun moving faster, prying open German lines, and everywhere they appeared, reports of a ghost Sherman circulated. The Germans were unsettled. Panthers and Tigers, their finest tanks, now began to track this single vehicle with white letters on its side. In the Mood. Poole's fame, or infamy, was growing, but with fame came escalating danger. The German Panthers were a nightmare of steel and firepower. Their frontal armor was nearly impervious to the standard Sherman 75mm gun, and their long-barreled 75mm cannons could destroy a Sherman from over a kilometer away. Tigers, even more terrifying, mounted an 88mm gun capable of punching through the Sherman like it was cardboard. The standard doctrine dictated extreme caution: engage only with support, never approach head-on, and always expect to lose tanks. Poole ignored it all. Near the village of St. Lo, the breakthrough of the hedgerow warfare had turned into a race across open fields. Intelligence reported a Panther platoon moving to block the Allied advance. The rest of the division hesitated. Point tanks were supposed to probe slowly, avoid ambushes, and retreat if necessary. But Poole's philosophy was the opposite. Speed is armor, aggression is survival. Baby, keep it coming. Move, move, move. Poole shouted, cigar clenched in his teeth, eyes scanning the treeline. The Sherman surged forward. Richards pressed the accelerator to the floor, the tracks chewing up mud and rocks. Ower, the gunner, swept the fields for movement, spotting glints of German optics in the sun-dappled hedgerows. Close kept the infantry suppressed with a disciplined hail of .30 caliber fire. Boggs, the loader, slammed shells into the breach without hesitation, keeping the main gun roaring. Poole, standing in the hatch, directed the chaos like a maestro conducting a symphony of destruction. The first Panther emerged, towering and menacing, its long barrel swinging toward the Sherman. Time slowed. Standard calculations would have dictated retreat. Poole did not hesitate. "Charge him," he screamed. The Sherman lunged forward, closing the distance faster than the Panther commander could react. The German gunner fired and the shell screamed past the tank, missing by mere inches. The sheer speed of the Sherman, combined with Poole's aggressive maneuvering, disrupted the Panther's ability to track a moving target. Ower's crosshairs found the weak point, the side armor where the treads met the hull. "Hit it!" Poole yelled. The 75mm shell struck true, severing the track. Sparks flew, metal sheared, and the Panther lurched helplessly. Another shell from Ower penetrated the thinner side armor, detonating the ammunition inside. The Panther exploded in a cloud of fire and smoke. It was a pattern that repeated itself again and again. Panthers and Tigers, expecting careful engagements, were unprepared for a Sherman that charged directly into their firing range while maintaining a full offensive. Poole exploited their reaction time, their expectation of caution, their training against predictable enemies. Each kill added to his legend, but the stakes grew higher. The Germans began prioritizing him. Anti-tank teams, sniper crews, and entire panzer platoons were assigned to track and eliminate in the mood. One evening near the town of La Loche, Poole faced a Tiger for the first time. The massive tank blocked the road ahead, its turret slowly swiveling, gun aimed like a predator waiting for its prey. Poole surveyed the battlefield. Standard military theory said he could not survive. The Tiger's frontal armor was too thick. The 76mm gun could barely scratch it from the sides. But Poole's mind worked differently. He analyzed the distance, the angle, the terrain. "Baby, flank right hard. Don't stop," he ordered. Richards obeyed, sliding the Sherman along a narrow embankment. Ower read the Tiger's weak point, the tracks. Boggs loaded the shell. "Fire!" Poole shouted. The shot hit and the Tiger lurched, its side exposed. Another shell, another detonation. Smoke and flame erupted, and the fearsome Tiger was reduced to twisted metal. This was Poole's genius. He understood the Sherman's weaknesses and turned them into strengths. Its speed and mobility allowed him to negate the enemy's superior firepower. Its high, narrow profile, normally a disadvantage, enabled him to maneuver over obstacles quickly. Poole's recklessness became a calculated risk. He didn't fight from a distance. He closed in, struck, and disappeared before reinforcements could respond. The psychological effect was immense. German troops began reporting a ghostly Sherman that appeared out of nowhere, struck with devastating efficiency, and vanished. Entire platoons refused to advance without confirming Poole's location. Captured soldiers spoke of him in hushed tones. The Texan ghost commanding a tank that no training or caution could withstand. Yet Poole never allowed the legend to cloud reality. He knew the math was unforgiving. Each engagement was a roll of the dice. Every Panther and Tiger destroyed was a temporary reprieve, not a guarantee. He pushed the Sherman and his crew to the edge of human endurance and mechanical reliability. Nights were spent cleaning guns, checking engines, studying maps. Days were filled with unrelenting combat. The crew lived on caffeine, adrenaline, and sheer willpower. But the trust between them, between Poole, Richards, Boggs, Close, and Ower, kept them alive. Their synchronization was perfect. Every move, every shot, every maneuver was anticipated, internalized, and executed without hesitation. By August, Poole's tally had grown terrifyingly high. Enemy vehicles, Panthers, Tigers, half-tracks, and supply trucks fell before in the mood with alarming regularity. He was no longer just a tank commander. He had become a force of nature, a nightmare on treads. The Allied advance accelerated because of him. The Germans adapted, but Poole's unpredictability, his disregard for convention, and his acceptance of death made him impossible to anticipate. For the crew this was both exhilarating and exhausting. The adrenaline could only last so long. Sleep, food, and morale were stretched to breaking points. Yet Poole inspired them to continue, to push the Sherman beyond what anyone thought possible. The math, the odds, the manuals, they were irrelevant. In the mood moved because of 5 men, perfectly synchronized, willing to embrace the impossible. And so the legend of War Daddy grew. In every village, every field, every intersection he left a mark. A shattered Panther, a burning Tiger, a trail of chaos, and a crew who trusted him implicitly. But the danger was growing too. Each victory brought them closer to the moment when luck would run out. By mid-September 1944, The storm that was Lafayette Poole and his crew had swept across France, leaving a trail of destroyed German armor and shattered morale. The legend of In the Mood was no longer rumor, it was fact. Allied forces marveled at the audacity of this single Sherman tank and its crew, while the Germans were consumed by fear. Intelligence reports referred to a Texan ghost, who struck like lightning, appeared where least expected, and never lingered for retaliation. Yet, the closer Poole's unit got to Germany, the higher the stakes. Every victory carried the weight of potential catastrophe, and the math, cold and unforgiving, was beginning to catch up. The town of Stahlberg, a narrow, gray settlement on the approaches to the Siegfried Line, was their next objective. Stahlberg was a choke point, its streets flanked by dense buildings, narrow intersections and hidden corners ideal for ambushes. The German army had prepared meticulously. Panthers and concealed anti-tank guns lined the roads, ready for the moment Poole's Sherman appeared. Standard doctrine would have dictated careful reconnaissance, flanking maneuvers, or waiting for supporting artillery. Poole's philosophy left no room for such caution. "Baby, I want this intersection cleared before they even know we're here." Poole barked over the radio. The Sherman surged forward. Richards pressed the accelerator, sending 30 tons of steel lurching over the cobblestones. The crew worked in perfect synchronization. Boggs loaded shells at a blistering pace, Ower scanned for targets and close cut down any infantry that dared peek from windows. Poole's cigar burned between his teeth, eyes darting from rooftop to turret. The man who had stood fearless in Normandy now faced an even deadlier test. As In the Mood turned a corner, Poole spotted the first sign of the trap. Less than 100 yards ahead, a Panther lay in wait, turret rotated perfectly, barrel aimed at the Sherman's belly. It was a kill box, and the German crew needed only to wait a fraction of a second. Time slowed. The odds were against them. The geometry of the streets and the raw power of the Panther promised certain death. "Back up!" Poole shouted. But Richards had no room to maneuver. The narrow cobblestone street left no option but to press forward. The Panther's gun fired first. The shell exploded in the street just in front of In the Mood, sending a blast of stone, dust, and smoke into the air. Sparks showered the turret, and the Sherman's engine screamed under the sudden pressure of evasive maneuvers. Poole's body tensed against the metal. The sheer force of the blast threw him halfway out of the hatch, cutting his face and filling his lungs with acrid smoke. Yet Poole's mind was unnervingly calm. There was no hesitation. He keyed the radio. "Ower, track him. Flank left. Fire at the tracks." Ower's hands moved with preternatural speed, guided by both training and instinct. Boggs slammed shells into the breach, each impact echoing like the beat of a drum. Close's machine guns swept the street, suppressing enemy infantry. The Sherman lurched and twisted, dodging rubble and debris, the engine straining, tires gripping cobblestones with impossible traction. The first shell hit the Panther's tracks. Sparks flew, steel bent, and the German behemoth lurched sideways, exposing its thinner armor. Another round from the Sherman penetrated the hull, detonating the ammunition inside. Fire roared, smoke poured into the street, and the Panther became a heap of molten metal. But the victory was fleeting. More Panthers, more hidden guns and infantry squads emerged from shadows. The trap was complete. The very streets designed to funnel and kill In the Mood had done their job. The Sherman was hit. Not fatally, but hard enough to throw the crew violently against the interior. Jailbird Boggs landed on the floor, momentarily dazed. Close's cheek was grazed by flying shrapnel. Poole's leg, already worn from constant strain, was slammed against the metal hatch. Blood and sweat mixed on his uniform. The tank, still operational but now compromised, was sitting in the heart of an ambush with the Germans methodically targeting their exposed positions. Poole's fatal flaw, his refusal to button up the hatch, was now a liability. His upper body, the part that had allowed him to command the battlefield with vision and intuition, was exposed to every sniper, every shell fragment, every rifle round. He could no longer see the entire battlefield. For the first time in over 80 days, the mathematics of survival were threatening to catch him. Yet he refused to panic. "Keep the gun moving. Baby, floor it. Don't stop, don't slow." His crew, bonded beyond reason, reacted instantly. Boggs loaded. Orr fired. Close swept the streets. Richards pushed the Sherman to its limits, dodging shell blasts and overturned debris. The adrenaline was a shield, but it couldn't last forever. The streets of Stahlberg were a coffin waiting to close. Then a dual-purpose flak gun hidden in a barn opened fire. Tracers split the air, green streaks that could kill with a heartbeat. One shell clipped the commander's hatch, showering Poole with sparks and causing a deep cut across his face. Another shell slammed into the cobblestones, tossing the Sherman sideways. The metal screeched. The crew was thrown against steel. Poole's body twisted unnaturally, his leg trapped, and he felt the first real sting of vulnerability he had ignored for months. The counterattack came with brutal efficiency. The Panther fired again, perfectly timed. Fragments tore through the turret. Poole's leg, already pinned, was struck by a high-velocity shard. The pain was immediate, excruciating, and utterly real. Poole realized with horrifying clarity, the war, at least for him, was over. The ace of aces, the ghost of Normandy, was being felled not by numbers, not by strategy, but by physics. Even in that moment, his concern was not for himself, but for in the mood. "Somebody take care of my tank," he rasped to Baby Richards, barely conscious. The crew, driven by loyalty and adrenaline, scrambled to extricate him, apply first aid, and stabilize the Sherman. Minutes felt like hours. The ambush had claimed its victory, but the bond forged in steel and fire ensured that Poole survived. When the dust settled and the mood lay damaged, the streets littered with debris and smoke. Poole's leg was shattered, a catastrophic injury that would end his time in frontline combat. For the first time, the math had won. The ace had met the limits of human endurance and the unforgiving reality of war. Yet even in defeat, the legend of Lafayette Poole endured, a tale of courage, audacity, and the refusal to yield to impossible odds. The cobblestone streets of Stahlberg fell silent after the ambush. Smoke curled from the shattered Sherman, twisted metal glinting in the gray light of the late afternoon. Yet amidst the wreckage, the men of In the Mood moved like soldiers possessed. Jailbird Boggs dragged Poole from the hatch, blood seeping through his uniform, eyes wide with both fear and determination. Schoolboy Close handed over the medical kit, trembling hands steady despite exhaustion. Baby Richards kept the engine running, idling the Sherman, ensuring it was ready to move if needed. For the first time in his combat career, Poole felt the weight of mortality pressing down. The medics arrived, moving with practiced efficiency, but even they paused at the sight of Poole's leg. The fracture was catastrophic, the shrapnel damage extensive. "High above the knee," one medic muttered, almost under his breath. Poole didn't flinch. He had faced German Tigers, Panthers, and the relentless machine of war itself, yet this, his own body betraying him, was something new. He was evacuated to a field hospital, the helicopter ride a blur of pain, shock, and the dull roar of machinery. In the cold, sterile hospital tent, Poole was aware of everything and nothing at the same time. The war outside raged on, bombs, guns, and death, but inside it was silent, save for the beeping of monitors and the sharp crackle of a surgeon's scalpel. When he woke from anesthesia, the reality was impossible to deny. One leg was gone. High above the knee. The mathematics of his survival had finally caught him. Poole, the man who had cheated death for 81 days, now faced a different battlefield. Life without the physical power that had defined him. For most men this would have been the end. For Lafayette Poole, it was merely another round in a fight he had never been willing to lose. His first thoughts were not of his own suffering, but of In the Mood, of his crew, of the machines that had carried them through fire and death. He wanted to know if they were safe, if the Sherman could be salvaged, if the men he trusted with his life had survived. He was a commander even in defeat. Back in the United States, the transition to civilian life was brutal. Poole returned to Texas at the age of 25, decorated, famous, and yet physically diminished. The Golden Gloves champion who had once relied on speed, agility, and raw power was now forced to rely on his mind alone. He opened a gas station, tried to live quietly, to embrace the mundane routines of a civilian, but the silence of peace was deafening. Sleep eluded him, and when it came, it was haunted by nightmares of hedgerows, exploding tanks, and the faces of men he had led into combat. Yet Poole was not a man to be defeated by circumstance. The army, which had once doubted him for his reckless courage, became his next battleground. Regulations dictated that amputees could not return to active duty. They were relegated to pensions and administrative roles. But Poole refused to accept the rules. He wrote letters, petitioned generals, and argued that the essence of a tank commander was not in the legs, but in the mind. The battlefield, he argued, was about decisions, instincts, and the courage to act, qualities he had proven beyond measure. His persistence paid off. In 1948, a rare exception was made. Lafayette Poole was allowed to re-enlist. The Army, perhaps recognizing that no regulations could contain a legend, found a role for him, not on the front lines of Europe, but at Fort Knox, Kentucky, the heart of the U.S. Armored Training Program. Here, Poole would channel his fury, skill, and experience into the next generation of tankers. The transition from warrior to instructor was not simple. Every day he reminded himself that teaching was combat of a different sort, and that mistakes in the classroom could prevent mistakes on the battlefield. Poole's presence at Fort Knox was commanding. He walked with a pronounced limp, prosthetic leg clicking against the floors, but every step radiated authority. Young soldiers, some barely older than schoolboy Close had been when he enlisted, were struck by the sheer magnitude of the man before them. Chest decorated with medals, hands scarred and calloused, eyes hardened by fire, Poole demanded respect not by words but by presence. "This is what happens when you hesitate," he would say, tapping his prosthetic with a cane. "Don't hesitate. You will die. Or worse, you'll let your crew die." The lessons he imparted were forged in the crucible of Normandy and France. Poole taught that a Sherman tank was only as effective as the crew within it. Speed was armor. Aggression saved lives. Confidence and trust between men were more important than any mechanical advantage. He drilled these principles relentlessly, shaping recruits into cohesive units capable of surviving conditions that would have broken lesser men. Poole's own experiences, flanking through hedgerows, ramming panthers, and charging into ambushes, were case studies in both brilliance and consequence. Yet, despite the classroom and training exercises, Poole remained haunted by what he had lost. The bond with his crew of In the Mood was unbroken in memory, though the war had dispersed them. He missed the chaos, the noise, the adrenaline that had defined his life for 81 days. Still, in instructing others he found purpose. He wasn't just teaching soldiers to survive, he was teaching them to dominate, to embrace risk without fear, and to understand that rules could be guides, not shackles. By 1960, Poole retired from the Army as a chief warrant officer, leaving behind a legacy not written in books, but in the minds and memories of the men he trained. Tanks evolved, guns grew larger, armor thicker, but his principles remained timeless. It was not steel that mattered, he insisted, it was the spirit inside the steel. And though he would never again roar through Normandy or crush a German tiger beneath a Sherman, Lafayette Poole had transformed from the ace of aces into the master of minds, ensuring that the lessons of war and courage endured far beyond the battlefield. When historians try to make sense of Lafayette Poole, they often start with the numbers. 81 days of continuous combat, 12 enemy tanks destroyed, 258 armored vehicles and self-propelled guns annihilated, over 1,000 enemy soldiers killed. These statistics defy the expectations of any military manual. A single Sherman tank, weak and flammable, against the might of the German Wehrmacht, should have been nothing more than a steel coffin on wheels. Yet Poole and his crew survived and dominated where others fell. To understand how, one must peel back the layers of legend and examine the mechanisms behind the myth. The first secret lies not in the tank but in the crew itself, the biological machine. Most tank crews were a collection of men doing a job, their interactions limited to orders and procedure. Poole's crew was different. They operated as a single organism, synchronized to instinct rather than commands. Baby Richards didn't need orders to accelerate or brake. He felt the battle through the Sherman's engine, responding as naturally as a heartbeat. Jailbird Boggs loaded shells with anticipation, predicting targets before they were identified. Schoolboy Close and Groundhog Oehler coordinated flawlessly with the others, each movement complementing the next. Poole's genius was in recognizing that a tank was not a mechanical weapon, but a living one, and the crew was its pulse. Secret number 2 was the fatal flaw turned into a tactic. Poole's recklessness, famously his refusal to stay buttoned up in the turret, seemed suicidal to outsiders. But he understood something the manuals did not. The enemy's command loop relied on predictability. The German tank doctrine followed a strict observe-orient-decide-act cycle. They trained to confront cautious, rule-bound opponents. Poole's aggression broke that loop. By charging straight into danger, exposing himself and refusing to hide, he forced hesitation. German crews paused, confused by a Sherman tank that defied logic. In that moment of cognitive dissonance, Poole struck. His fatal flaw became an instrument of psychological warfare. The unpredictable nature of In the Mood was as deadly as the guns themselves. The third secret was the uncanny eyes of Groundhog Willis Oehler. In tank warfare, the first shot often decides the outcome. To shoot first, one must see first. Oehler's vision was extraordinary, capable of spotting targets at distances that would render other gunners blind. But it was more than eyesight, it was trust. Poole never second-guessed Oehler. When Oehler identified a target, Poole ordered the gun traverse without hesitation. This eliminated delays, a fraction of a second that could mean life or death. By trusting his gunner implicitly, Poole amplified the lethality of the Sherman far beyond its technical capabilities. In essence, the crew's eyes and Poole's instincts became the most potent weapons in the European theater. Finally, there was the acceptance of death, the darkest, most terrifying secret. Most soldiers act defensively, preserving their own lives. Poole acted without such fear. He told General Rose, "I'm already dead." This was not bravado, it was a philosophy of liberation. By removing fear from the equation, Poole freed himself to take risks that others could not even contemplate. He pushed the Sherman to its mechanical limits, drove straight into ambushes, and stood exposed in the turret because he did not anticipate returning. This fatalism, this cold acknowledgement of mortality, made him unpredictable, unstoppable, and nearly invincible. Poole's courage was not the absence of fear, but the complete acceptance of it, transformed into action. These four factors, the biological crew, the tactical flaw, the eyes of the gunner, and the acceptance of death, combined to create something more than a tank commander. They forged a legend. Poole's story was not merely about surviving Normandy or destroying German armor. It was about transcending the rules, about demonstrating that courage, coordination, and audacity could overcome technology. The Sherman was a flawed machine, but the spirit inside it was limitless. Poole's influence did not end with the war. As an instructor at Fort Knox, he instilled these lessons in generations of tank crews. He drilled into them the importance of synchronization, trust, and aggressive action. The manuals were guides. Intuition and decisiveness were law. The Sherman may have been replaced by Pershing's, Patton's, and eventually Abrams tanks, but the principles Poole taught endured. The U.S. Armored Corps carried his philosophy into Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Every time a crew operated with unity and confidence, every time they struck with calculated audacity, they carried a piece of War Daddy's legacy. Yet Poole's story is not solely about tactics or heroics. It is about defiance. It is about refusing to accept the limits imposed by circumstance, by mathematics, or by tradition. It is about a man who stared into the heart of death for 81 days and decided that odds, logic, and probability were irrelevant. When the world said he could not survive, he proved otherwise. When the army said an amputee could not command, he returned to Fort Knox. When the Sherman said it could not kill a tiger, he charged. In every case, Poole rewrote the rules. Today, the tale of Lafayette Poole lives in both memory and monument. The Sherman in the mood may rest abandoned in a German field, but its spirit endures in the training manuals, in the stories of tank crews, and in the ethos of audacity and unity that he championed. Historians, soldiers, and civilians alike are inspired not by the destruction he wrought, but by the courage, strategy, and refusal to be constrained by limits. Poole's life was a demonstration that survival and victory often belong not to the strongest, but to the boldest, and to those willing to stare into the impossible and act anyway. When we examine Poole's 81 days of carnage, the numbers alone impress. But when we examine the principles behind the numbers, we find something far more remarkable. A philosophy of war and life, forged in fire, tested against the odds, and proven in the chaos of combat. The Sherman was a steel coffin, yes. But in the hands of Lafayette Poole and his crew, it became a crucible of courage, a testament to human ingenuity, and a weapon capable of turning the improbable into reality. Poole died on May 30, 1991, a hero not only of war but of human will. He had lived a life defined not by statistics or constraints, but by audacity, vision, and the refusal to surrender. The legacy of War Daddy is not found in medals or stories alone. It is in the understanding that sometimes, the impossible exists only until someone dares to achieve it. The story of Lafayette Poole does not end in the mud and smoke of Normandy, or in the burning streets of Stahlberg. It ends in something far subtler, yet far more enduring: the triumph of audacity, the persistence of spirit, and the challenge to the laws of probability. The numbers alone, 12 enemy tanks, 258 armored vehicles, over 1,000 soldiers killed, are staggering. Yet they are only the surface, a reflection of something deeper. A man who refused to let the world, the army, or even fate itself dictate the terms of his survival. Poole's life is a study in defiance. The mathematics of the battlefield were brutal. Sherman tanks were underpowered, underarmed, and flammable. Doctrine dictated that 5 Shermans were needed to destroy a single Tiger, and that 3 of those 5 would likely be destroyed in the attempt. Statistically, Lafayette Poole and his crew should have perished in the first week. But Poole ignored the math. He did not flinch at odds. He did not retreat in the face of danger. Instead, he invented his own rules of engagement, a set of principles that prioritized speed, aggression, and absolute trust in the men inside the tank. This refusal to surrender to probability is perhaps the most powerful lesson of his story. Poole demonstrated that survival is not simply the product of numbers, training, or machinery. It is the product of mindset. By accepting death and treating it as a constant companion, he liberated himself from fear, allowing him to act with a clarity and decisiveness impossible for ordinary men. The Sherman was a coffin. Poole turned it into a weapon of unstoppable force because he refused to be constrained by its limitations. He looked danger in the eye and dared it to strike again and again. But courage alone cannot explain his success. Poole's genius lay in the fusion of human instinct with mechanical capability. He treated the Sherman not as a machine to be controlled, but as an extension of his own body, and the crew as extensions of his own senses. Baby Richards felt the tank as an organism, responding instinctively to commands, terrain, and enemy positions. Jailbird Boggs moved shells faster than any man could calculate. Schoolboy Close and Groundhog Oler provided vision and precision, completing a symphony of coordinated movement that no technical specification could predict. In Poole's world, the Sherman was not just steel and guns, it was a living weapon, a biological entity capable of feats that seemed impossible. Poole's post-war life reinforces the philosophy he demonstrated on the battlefield. Returning to Texas after losing his leg, he confronted a world that had no use for him. Civilian life offered comfort and routine, but it could not replicate the intensity, the purpose, and the bond he had found in combat. Yet he refused to accept limits, even when the army itself said an amputee could not serve in combat. Through persistence and argument, he returned to active duty, not to sit behind a desk but to teach at Fort Knox, to instill the principles he had lived in the lives of young tankers. The lesson was clear. Leadership is not measured by conformity to rules, but by the ability to inspire, to coordinate, and to act decisively in the face of uncertainty. The psychological impact of Poole's methods cannot be overstated. Enemy soldiers came to fear the Sherman within the mood painted on the side, convinced it was some supernatural weapon. Poole turned aggression into a form of psychological warfare. He proved that the human mind, properly trained and unflinching, could overcome even the deadliest machines. And within his own division, his example was contagious. The men behind him charged with confidence. The infantry pressed forward with renewed courage. Poole understood that war was not just physics and ballistics. It was trust, willpower, and audacity multiplied by teamwork. Lafayette Poole's story is also a cautionary tale. His recklessness, his exposure, and his obsession with leading from the front nearly cost him everything. He was wounded, thrown from his tank, and had his leg amputated. The Sherman he loved lay abandoned in a ditch, a reminder that even genius has its limits. Yet what made Poole remarkable was his refusal to let failure define him. He rebuilt his life, reinvented his role, and continued to shape the future of armored warfare. The mathematics of survival did not change, but Poole's understanding of human potential had. Today, when we study the history of World War II, we remember generals, strategies, and battles. But Lafayette Poole teaches us something different. He shows that individuals, armed with courage, instinct, and a willingness to defy expectation, can alter the course of events. He reminds us that rules are guides, not absolutes, and that audacity often achieves what obedience cannot. In the steel of a Sherman, in the teamwork of 5 men, and in the refusal to accept odds, he created a template for overcoming impossible situations. The final lesson of War Daddy is profoundly human. Life, like war, is full of statistics, probabilities, and forces beyond our control. The math may predict failure. The odds may seem insurmountable. Yet, as Lafayette Poole demonstrated, it is possible to rewrite the rules. Courage, coordination, trust, and acceptance of mortality, these are the true weapons. Poole's legacy endures not because of medals or fame, but because he proved that the spirit inside the steel, the human element, can triumph against even the harshest equations. When we remember Lafayette Poole, we remember more than a soldier. We remember a philosophy of audacity. We remember the man who charged headlong into danger, who trusted his crew, who treated a death trap of a tank like a weapon of miracles, and who refused to be constrained by the world's expectations. We remember the lesson that defines the heart of every great story. When the odds are stacked against you, when the math says you will fail, the question remains, will you retreat or will you charge forward and make the impossible possible?